So what are the implications for the management of the firm in a worker cooperative?
Right. Well, the idea is that the firm basically becomes a small democratic organization. And this raises the whole question about democracy in the workplace and why in a society where everybody's talking about democracy and we're willing to have adventures all over the world to make the world safe for democracy, don't we have democracy in every firm, every organization? And that gets us back into another story about intellectual history. And once again, just as slavery was incorrectly, from the theoretical view, incorrectly sold as being inherently involuntary, when in fact you had voluntary slavery as a way that the people that tried to legitimate it argued that it was implicit contract, so we've had democracy sold as government based on the consent of the governed. And that is not of course it's based on consent of the governed, but democracy is something more, because all the non-democratic regimes throughout history that had any sophisticated defense would all say it's based on a contract where you have given up your right to govern yourself. You have alienated the right to self-governance to the monarch or to the king or the sovereign or whoever it was. And this is even there in Roman law, the lex regia of the Roman people give up their right to govern themselves to the prince. And the question was, is that delegation, or is that giving up a alienation where the prince rules in his own name, or is it a delegation where the prince rules as a representative or a delegate or a trustee for the people? And so two diametrically opposite interpretations of this contract. And all of democratic theory came out of the interpretation that this is a representative relationship, delegation, not an alienation. Whereas the sophisticated defenses of monarchy where the people emanate their right, so that the king doesn't rule in the name of the people, he rules in his own name, and doesn't have to satisfy any representative function and so forth. So your self-governance is like a commodity that you can give up and transfer to the monarch. And that's been the sophisticated defense of non-democratic government all along. So simply to say democracy is based on the consent of the governed is wrong, because those non-democratic systems are also seen as being based on the consent of the governed, but the consent to a contract or constitution that gave up your right to govern yourself. So they weren't democratic constitutions, they were anti-democratic constitutions. Both had consent, theoretically, but the democratic theory was there's something wrong with a non-democratic constitution, a contract where you give up the right to govern yourself, so that all constitutions should be inherently democratic. Now, to make a long story short, of course, the employment contract is the non-democratic constitution for the workplace. The employer is not the representative of the employees. The employer is not the trustee or the delegate of the employees. So that contract is actually alienating the right of management, the right of governance of people within the scope of the contract to the employer. And that's the thing that we have abolished in the political sphere. If you tried to organize, say, a municipality somewhere in the United States where you gave up the right to govern yourself and somebody was a little king, that would be declared unconstitutional overnight. I mean, people would allow it. But every day that's what happens inside the firms, is people give up the right to govern themselves in an economic context, and nobody thinks twice about it. This is perfectly normal. And so you have firms run by people that are not representatives of the people they're managing. They're not delegates, they're not trustees. They are ruled in their own name. The employer manages in his own name. So you have this paradox of this country, and of course the same in Europe and countries around the world, which all swear that they're ready to fight and die for democracy, and yet every day, all day long, in every firm in these countries, people give up the right to govern themselves, and nobody even wants to talk about it. And it's the same idea that here's a voluntary contract that gives up the right to govern yourself, puts you in the position of a person who is a subject, not a citizen. And the traditional name for this contract was the Pact of Subjection, where you made yourself into a subject of the sovereign, not a citizen anymore. So you gave up like your citizenship rights and so forth. And this philosopher I mentioned before, Robert Nozick, he also said we should allow people to do that. That's a libertarian thing. Libertarian, if it's a voluntary contract, nothing wrong with it. Sell yourself into slavery, give up your self-governed rights, all fine. And the word democracy does even appear in the index of this most famous book about all this, because democracy doesn't have a role, that you simply choose who you're going to give up your rights to. So all this is going back into the background to the employment contract, the contract to rent people, and it's the contract politically to give up the right to govern yourself in the workplace. So it's the sort of thing that we would not allow in the political sphere. Has been abolished historically, and that's what the fights were about. So it wasn't about government based on consent. It was government based upon this idea that I can give up the right to govern myself to this whoever the sovereign is, and so in the firm, it's like a little democracy, but it's not. It's private. It's not. We have this idea somehow democratic rights only apply in the public sphere and not the private sphere, and that's really a historical creation of the idea that we want. Once we got political democracy settled in the 19th century as the sort of norm in the advanced countries, then this idea came about that well, there's a private sphere, and in the private sphere it's okay not to have democracy, and this is what happened inside the family, where the father can rule over the wife and the kids, and they don't have any rights because that's all private, so you shouldn't touch that. And so we've finally seen that human rights are not parsed into only existing in the public sphere, not in a private sphere, and the same with democratic rights. So the firm, it's not part of the public sphere, it's not part of the government taking over firms or anything. These are private organizations, but they're democratic organizations in the sense that the people that work in the firm are the members, they're the citizens, they vote. They vote in the board of directors, and the board of directors chooses the management or however you want to organize the internal democracy. But so the employment contract either is an economic contract to rent yourself out, or as a political contract to give up your right to govern yourself is bogus and void on both grounds. And those contracts, in the longer term, the slavery contract, and in the political sphere, the political contract to give up your rights have all been abolished. And it's what remains, but it remains as sort of the centerpiece of our system, and that's why it's so controversial, and why people don't want to talk about it, don't want to think about it. And even though they're all willing to lay down their life for democracy, they don't even seem to notice that it's the giving up democracy is what happens every day in the firms, and the employer is not the representative or the delegate of the employees, and so the whole employer-employee relationship there is a non-democratic relationship. And so this website is dedicated to try to get these issues out there and get people to think about the life in which they're leading. And so you're perfecting democracy, you're perfecting private property, and then every time you try to raise the issues, people say, oh, this is communism. It's the opposite of communism. There's no state ownership involved. This is all private. It's perfecting the private property, giving people the fruits of their labor. But people don't want to talk about it because they've all been forced into this sort of dichotomous view that anything different from what we have now has got to be communism, and so try to force the issue into that kind of a straitjacket. And so we're trying to show that even historically that these are issues about democracy, these are issues about inalienable rights, these are issues about getting the fruits of your labor, all things that were not part of socialism and not part of communism at all, that don't involve government ownership or government control or anything like that. It's changing the private organizations so they become just in terms of private property, they become democratic in terms of the internal governance of the firm, and they don't put people in this position of an instrument that is employed by the employer. And so they abolish this contract that sort of gives the legal cover story to this dehumanization that goes on in the ordinary firm.